Hello again, future attorneys. Welcome to lecture number 7 of our last-minute tip lecture series for the 2025 bar exam. This lecture will focus on jurisprudence updates and related concepts in criminal law to help you prepare for the last day of the bar exam. So let's start. Let's start with the basic principles first. Let's distinguish mala in se and mala prohibita crimes. Mala in se and mala prohibita are classifications of crimes according to nature. A mala in se crime is that which is wrong in itself. It is inherently immoral or evil. While mala prohibita crimes are not necessarily evil, they are just prohibited because the law says so. In both cases, there is an element of intent to be proven. In mala in se crimes, the prosecution must prove the criminal intent or the intent to commit the crime. While in mala prohibita crimes, the prosecution need only to prove that the accused intended to perpetrate the act or that the act was done knowingly and voluntarily. We'll further discuss the element of intent shortly. Since criminal intent is an element of mala in se crimes, it follows that good faith is a defense in these offenses, while it is not so in mala prohibita crimes. Lastly, as a general rule, crimes punished under the revised penal code are mala in se, but there are exceptions. For example, technical malversation is punished under the revised penal code, although it is malum prohibitum. And as a general rule, crimes punished under special penal laws are mala prohibita. But there are also exceptions. For instance, the offense of causing mental and emotional anguish under the Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children Act is mala in se, even though it is punished under a special penal law. Okay, we just mentioned this, but let me repeat. Just because an offense is malum prohibitum does not necessarily mean that the prosecution does not need to prove any intent at all. In mala prohibita crimes, the prosecution must still prove that the prohibited act was done intentionally by the accused or that the accused had the intent to perpetrate the act, as distinguished from intent to commit the crime. Intent to perpetrate the act is what needs to be shown in crimes mala prohibita. And this is simply the voluntariness of the act or the knowledge of the act being done. There is intent to perpetrate the act if the act is done freely and consciously. So how is this different from criminal intent or the intent which must be proved in mala in se crimes? Criminal intent is a state of mind that goes beyond voluntariness. This means that the accused knows the nature of the act, that is, he knows the act is wrong, yet he still commits the act. A recent case here is Valenzuela versus People. This case involved the violation of PD 957 or the Subdivision and Condominium Buyers Protective Decree. Remember our earlier distinction. Crimes punished under special penal laws are generally mala prohibita. Under PD 957, the sale of subdivision lots must be registered with the Registry of Deeds. This is a malum prohibitum offense. The failure to register a sale is not inherently wrong. It is an offense only because PD 957 punishes it. So in the prosecution of this offense, criminal intent need not be proved, but it must still be proved that the illegal act, the non-registration of the sale, was done voluntarily, freely, and consciously. Let's apply these requirements to the facts of this case. In Valenzuela versus People, the accused is the president of a real estate company. The company sold subdivision lots to a Ricardo Porteo. The buyer discovered that the sale was not registered with the Registry of Deeds as required under PD 957. So he filed a criminal complaint for violation of the law against the company president. In this case, the Supreme Court acquitted the company president for failure of the prosecution to prove that he, as president of the real estate company, personally or willfully caused the non-registration. Just because he is the president of the company does not automatically make him liable. It must first be proved that he voluntarily and actively participated, or he had the power to prevent the violation before criminal liability attaches. Next, let's discuss another basic concept, the pro reo principle. In dubio pro reo, it means when in doubt for the accused. The bar chair penned a case which illustrates this principle. This is the case of Sama versus People decided in 2021. In this case, the accused, who are members of the Iraya Mangyan IPs, were charged with illegal logging under the Forestry Code. This is the crime of cutting, gathering, or collecting timber products in any public or private land without authority from the state. In this case, the Supreme Court acquitted the accused after finding reasonable doubt as to whether they gathered the timbers without authority from the state. So where did that reasonable doubt come from? The reasonable doubt came from the interpretation of the term authority from the state. Because of the constitutional provisions, the passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, and related regulations, recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples over their ancestral lands and domains, a confusion arose. The Supreme Court said that the term authority from the state is more expansive now, and it's no longer limited to the tree cutting permits issued by the DENR. Presently, this authority can be reasonably interpreted as inclusive of other modes of authority, such as the exercise of indigenous peoples' rights. In this case, it was established that the tree cutting was done pursuant to a decision of the accused's tribal elders to build a communal toilet for the community. And from the point of view of the tribe, this is equivalent to permission. Also, the non-government organization assisting them gave support or guidance that the cutting was permissible for community purposes. The Supreme Court said that the accused's reliance on the representations of the NGO assisting them is reasonable in view of their limited access to formal education. Lastly, the NCIP, or the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples itself, previously recognized their ancestral domain rights through a certificate of ancestral domain claim, or that at least through acknowledgement of their rights under the IPRA. The Supreme Court said that the accused interpreted this recognition as a form of state authority to use timber within their ancestral land for communal purposes. All these circumstances give rise to a reasonable doubt as to the existence of the accused's IP right to log the dita tree for the construction of a communal toilet for the Iraya Mangyan community. Note that in this case, the Supreme Court also discussed the distinction between mala inse and mala prohibita crimes as regards the requirement of intent. Illegal logging is an offense punished by a special law, the Forestry Code. This is a malum prohibitum offense. But although the Supreme Court found that the accused here voluntarily and knowingly cut and gathered the tree, there remains a reasonable doubt as to whether that act was really without authority from the state. This case is an illustration that although a crime was malum prohibitum, conviction does not automatically follow once it is shown that the illegal act was voluntarily and knowingly committed, if there is reasonable doubt as to the existence of an element of the offense. Next, let's discuss crimes against honor, starting with libel. The crime of libel is defined under Article 353 of the Revised Penal Code. My personal shortcut for this offense is public malicious imputation. Essentially, it is the crime of making defamatory statements in public that damages a person's reputation, whether the person is living or dead. This offense has 4 elements. First is the imputation of a crime, vice, or defect, etc. It can be in the form of criminal accusations or alleging involvement in criminal activities or imputing to the other any vice, defect, or condition. For libel, this imputation should be in the form of writing or other similar means. The defamatory remarks may be published in a newspaper or in a magazine or even through films or media broadcasts. The common element among these means is permanency, as compared to uttering defamatory remarks in public, which is considered oral defamation. We'll discuss oral defamation next. An example of this element is Daryl Yap's film about the supposed rape of Pepsi Paloma. The trailer of that film identified Vic Soto as one of the perpetrators, and this led Soto to file a cyber libel case against Yap. The film involved an imputation of crime against Vic Soto. The second element is malice. We'll discuss the element of malice shortly. Third element, the imputation must be directed against a juridical or a natural person, including those who are already dead. And last element, the remarks tend to damage the reputation or cause discredit or dishonor to the persons involved. Let's now focus on the element of malice in the crime of libel. Malice in libel refers to the intent to damage the reputation of the person defamed. Libel is a mala in se offense, so this malice must be proved as an element of the offense. However, the law already established a presumption that every defamatory remark is done with malice, so malice need not be proved as a general rule. This is what we call legal malice. But there are also exceptions to this rule, and these are the cases of qualified privileged communications. In these cases, malice is not presumed and must be shown. So what are these instances of qualified privileged communications? We have the exceptions under the Revised Penal Code. First is in case of private communications made in the performance of legal, moral, or social duty. And second is fair and true report on official and non-confidential proceedings. An example of the second exception is in relation to Senate hearings on flood control projects. If a newspaper simply reported the proceedings as is, such as that the Discayas secured billions worth of government flood control projects and reported on their answer to the questions about their lavish lifestyles, like their display of luxury vehicles, that is fair and true report of the proceedings, and it is qualifiedly privileged. But if the news report said that the Discayas are clearly swindlers or crooks and should be jailed, this might not be fair, since this is no longer an accurate representation of the Senate proceedings. The third instance of qualified privilege communications is the fair comment doctrine. These are fair commentaries on matters of public interest. For example, comments on acts of public officers in their public capacity subject of news articles. And the last instance of qualified privilege communications is remarks directed to public figures or celebrities. So what standard do we use in proving actual malice in libel cases? In proving actual malice, we use the reckless disregard standard. Under the reckless disregard standard, there is libel if the publication was done, first, with the knowledge that it is false, or second, with reckless disregard as to whether it is false or not. This standard means that malice is proven if the accused knew or was almost sure that what they said was false. Last on this topic, we also need to consider the absolutely privileged communications. In case of absolutely privileged communications, they are not actionable. It means that even if the defamatory remarks are uttered in bad faith, the person who made the defamatory remark cannot be prosecuted for libel or oral defamation. Examples of these absolutely privileged communications are statements made by Congress in the discharge of their functions. Another, official communications by public officers in the discharge of their official duties. Statements and allegations in pleadings, and answers of witnesses in the course of proceedings, provided they are relevant and responsive. Okay, let's just recall the three instances we need to consider on the element of malice in libel cases. Number 1. As a general rule, malice is presumed in every defamatory remark. Hence, malice need not be proved. This is legal malice. But in cases of qualified privilege communications, there is no such presumption. Thus, actual malice must be proved. And last, in case of absolute privilege communications, there is also no presumption of malice. And even if there is actual malice, the person who uttered the defamatory remark cannot be prosecuted, considering the privileged nature of the speech. Next, let's discuss cyber libel. When the libelous remarks are published online, the offense is cyber libel or online libel, defined and punished under the Cybercrime Prevention Act in relation to the revised penal code. Cyber libel is the same libel under the revised penal code, but done using computer systems. And this includes social media posts and publications in websites or online blogs. So who can be held liable for cyber libel? So the author, the editor, the publisher, the business manager, the owner of the printing press in case of traditional libel. They all may be held liable. But in case of social media posts, can those who simply reacted or commented or shared the original post, can they be held liable? The Supreme Court, in Decini versus Secretary of Justice, held that only the author of the original post can be held liable for cyber libel, but not those who simply pressed like, comment, or share. We have another case here. People versus Soliman about the imposable penalty for cyber libel. Under the Cybercrime Prevention Act, the punishment for cyber libel is 1 degree higher than that provided under the Revised Penal Code. And under the Revised Penal Code, the penalty for libel is prisión correccional or fine of 40,000 to 1.2 million or both. Considering this, may the court impose a fine only for online libel. This is the issue resolved by the court in People versus Soliman. In this case, Soliman posted on Facebook criticizing the former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, alleging that the Assistant Secretary was delaying the issuance or release of his sanitary permits, and that the former DA Assistant Secretary was involved in smuggling activities. Also, that he abused his position and was unfit for public office. The trial court found Soliman guilty of cyber libel and imposed the penalty of 50,000 fine only. The people, however, filed a petition for certiorari, questioning the penalty imposed. The people argued that the penalty should have been imprisonment higher by 1 degree to that provided in the Revised Penal Code instead of fine only. The Supreme Court denied this petition and held that for cyber libel cases, the courts can impose the alternative penalty of fine only in lieu of imprisonment. This ruling is based on the language of the Revised Penal Code. Under the RPC, the penalty for libel is imprisonment or fine, or both. The conjunction used is or, not and. So the court may choose whether to impose imprisonment only or fine only, or both. This ruling applies to both traditional libel and online libel, since the penalty is that provided in the RPC. The Supreme Court also said that since Soliman deleted his post, apologized, and acted out of anger, the trial court did not gravely abuse its discretion in imposing fine only, 1 degree higher than that provided in the Revised Penal Code. So this is one principle in cyber libel. The penalty is 1 degree higher than that provided in the Revised Penal Code. And that penalty can be fine only, especially if the accused already took down the post or apologized for it. Another thing to remember in cyber libel cases is that it prescribes in 12 years as compared to traditional libel, which prescribes in 1 year only. And lastly, libel under the Revised Penal Code and cyber libel are essentially the same offenses. They only differ in the mode of commission. So a person cannot be prosecuted under both offenses for the same act. Otherwise, the accused will be placed on double jeopardy. Remember this rule also for criminal procedure. Now let's go to the crime of slander or oral defamation. This is also a crime against honor defined under Article 358 of the Revised Penal Code. Slander is essentially libel by spoken words. There is no characteristic of permanency, unlike in libel, which is committed through publications. Slander or oral defamation means insulting or discrediting someone in public by uttering or saying words that damage their reputation. We have a case here, the 2023 decision of the Supreme Court in Labargan versus People. Here the accused shouted from her terrace that a barangay kagawad was bugo, walay grado, ignorante, which meant stupid, has no education, and is ignorant. This is not directed to anyone in particular, but shouted publicly. And the remarks were made in relation to a barangay conciliation proceedings involving the accused, where the kagawad acted as a mediator. She was charged with grave oral defamation, but the Supreme Court acquitted the accused, ruling that statements against public officers do not constitute oral defamation when made in relation to the discharge of their official duties, unless the prosecution establishes that they were uttered with actual malice. So this is part of the qualified privileged communication we mentioned earlier, those directed against public officers in the discharge of their functions. So remember our rule. The prosecution of libel or slander involving qualified privileged communications needs proof of actual malice. Here, the prosecution failed to prove that the accused spoke with actual malice, since her statements were directed at the kagawad in her capacity as a kagawad, and are criticisms of her competence and partiality in handling the barangay conciliation proceedings. Although the accused's remarks were insulting or offensive, these are not personal attacks, but relates to the kagawad's duties. Just to recall, defamatory remarks against public officials related to their official duties are not actionable unless actual malice is proven. And again, the standard for actual malice is reckless disregard, meaning the remarks were made knowing they were false or with reckless disregard of whether they are false or not. Now let's move on to crimes against persons, specifically the crime of rape. Just note also, rape is no longer a crime against chastity. It is already classified as a crime against persons. So what's the significance of this change? This is just a review. The classification of rape as a crime against persons means that it can already be prosecuted de officio, meaning it can be prosecuted even without a complaint filed by the private offended party. Before, when rape was classified as a crime against chastity, it was a private crime, meaning it could not be prosecuted without a complaint filed by the offended party or the persons authorized by law. Next, let's review the two kinds of rape. Rape can be committed, number 1, by sexual intercourse, and number 2, by sexual assault. Rape by sexual intercourse is committed by a man having the carnal knowledge of a woman under the circumstances provided by law. So, namely, through fit or through force, intimidation, or threat. Under this mode of committing rape, the Supreme Court clarified in a 2024 case that there is no requirement to prove that the victim resisted. In that case, People versus ZZZ, the Supreme Court also categorically abandoned previous decisions stating that a woman cannot claim to be a rape victim unless she fought back. According to the Supreme Court in this case, these rulings are inconsistent with the current legal framework. The second mode of committing rape by sexual intercourse is when the woman is deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious. The third mode is by means of fraudulent machinations or grave abuse of authority. And lastly, if the woman is below 16 years of age or demented. This last instance is what we call statutory rape. So even if the other circumstances we just mentioned were not present, there is still rape if the victim is below 16 years or demented. So let's just review the exception to the rule on statutory rape. We have 3 requirements for this exception to apply. Number 1, the woman is 13 years old and above but below 16 years old. Note that if the woman is below 13 years old, this exception will not apply. Second requirement, the age difference between the man and the woman is no more than 3 years. And last, the sexual act is proven to be consensual, non-abusive, and non-exploitative. The crime of rape is qualified if the child is a minor and the offender is a relative, either the child's father or stepfather or her grandfather or other ascendant, or her relative within the third degree, or if the offender is the mother's common law partner. There are other qualifying circumstances. You may check the anti-rape law, but this is the usual subject of cases, the qualifying circumstance of minority plus relationship. One example of this case is People versus XXX, a 2024 qualified rape case. The court here allowed the admission of the 14-year-old child victim's sinumpaang salaysay, even though the prosecution failed to present the child as witness, citing the unavailable child doctrine under the rule on examination of child witness. This is relevant for your criminal procedure review as well, so let's discuss it here. Under the unavailable child doctrine, the hearsay testimony of a child describing an actual or attempted child abuse may be admitted if the child is unavailable due to death, injury, or mental illness, or if testifying will expose the child to psychological injury, or if the prosecution cannot procure the attendance of the child and the child's hearsay testimony is corroborated by other admissible evidence. In this case, the Supreme Court upheld the trial court's application of the unavailable child doctrine. The offender here is the child's father, and the mother admitted that she sent the child away with their relatives to prevent her from testifying against her father. And the prosecution is unable to procure the child's attendance through other means. Given these circumstances, the Supreme Court ruled that the trial court's application of the unavailable child doctrine is proper since the prosecution cannot obtain the child's attendance, and that there are other admissible pieces of evidence to corroborate her sinumpaang salaysay, such as the testimony of other prosecution witnesses. In another 2023 case, People versus XXX, the Supreme Court cited the theory of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome in assessing the credibility of a child witness. This theory seeks to explain situations wherein the actions of victims of child abuse may seem strange to an adult. So this is another case of qualified statutory rape, where the father was charged with the rape of his two minor daughters, one 14 years old and another 11 years old. So remember the proper denomination of this offense: qualified statutory rape, not simply qualified rape. In this case, the father questioned the testimonies of his daughters as supposedly contrary to human experience. He argued that her daughter should have shouted or made some noise when she was being raped, since her siblings were sleeping in the same room, and that she should have avoided being left alone with him. As to the other daughter, he insisted that during the second incident of rape, the child should have already known that he had ill intentions and that she should have run away instead of following him. The Supreme Court dismissed his arguments and applied the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome as a model for understanding why the behavior of children who have been sexually abused may seem strange to some adults. Under the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, there are 5 stages. The first stage is secrecy, wherein the child keeps the abuse secret because of shame or embarrassment, and sometimes due to fear of threats by the abuser. The second stage is helplessness, or the feeling that the child cannot do anything since the abuser is a parental figure or a trusted adult. The third stage is entrapment and accommodation, which happen when the child fails to seek protection. The fourth stage is delayed disclosure. It is said that the child victim tends to delay the disclosure of the abuse because of fear, shame, or emotional confusion. And the final stage is called retraction, and it is said to involve the child's denial that the abuse had occurred. Applying this theory, the Supreme Court said that the accused cannot attack the testimony of child victims for being inconsistent or contrary to human experience. The Supreme Court said that there is no single response in situations of abuse, especially in extreme traumatic situations like incest. In any case, just remember that the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome is a theory used to rehabilitate the credibility of the child victim when the abuser alleges that her testimony is inconsistent or contrary to human experience. And just one last point. Remember also that there is no frustrated rape. Full penetration is not required, as even the slightest penetration consummates this act. The other kind of rape is rape by sexual assault. This is also known as the genderless rape because it can be committed even against a man. It can be committed by a woman against a man or another woman. In other words, the genders of the offender and the victim are irrelevant in the prosecution of rape by sexual assault. This type of rape is committed by inserting a man's penis in another person's mouth or anal orifice, or by inserting any other object in the genitals or anal orifice of another person, under the circumstances that we just mentioned in rape by sexual intercourse. So if it's made by fit, force, intimidation, or threat, or if the victim, whether man or woman, is deprived of reason or is unconscious, or by means of fraudulent machinations or grave abuse of authority, and if the victim is below 16 years old. Also note this for your criminal procedure review. Rape by sexual assault is not necessarily included in the crime of rape by sexual intercourse. These are distinct offenses. So if the information alleges rape by sexual intercourse, the accused cannot be convicted of rape by sexual assault without violating his right to be informed of the nature and cause of accusation against him. Let's move on now to crimes against property. The most commonly asked here is robbery. Remember, the elements of robbery are suvic. S. The subject matter is personal property belonging to another. If there is forcible taking of real property, the crime is usurpation, not robbery. U. Unlawful taking. V. The taking is done with violence against or intimidation of persons, number 1. And number 2, with force upon things. These are also the two kinds of robbery. And this is the element that sets robbery apart from theft. When this element is absent, the crime committed is theft. Next element is I. intent to gain, which is presumed from the unlawful taking. And the last element is C. The taking was done without the owner's consent. So let's discuss here two notable cases by the bar chair. First is Tria versus People, a 2023 case. In this case, Tria's girlfriend gave him the password to her Facebook page because he was jealous. Tria later uploaded half-naked photos of his girlfriend and a screenshot of their sex video to the FB page. He then demanded 55,000 pesos in return for deleting the photos. Tria was convicted of robbery. The Supreme Court ruled here that Tria's girlfriend was clearly forced to part with her money in exchange for the deletion of her nude photos posted on her Facebook page, since her compromising photos damaged and continued to damage her family life, reputation, and online business. This made her feel like she had no choice but to yield to Tria's demands. The taking was deemed complete the moment Tria gained possession of her money. Now let's discuss the special complex crime of robbery with homicide. I hope you remember the concept of a special complex crime. This is a single indivisible offense, especially punished under the revised penal code. The bar chair has an important case here, People versus Casabuena. This is a 2020 case. Here, 3 accused robbed a jeepney. One blocked the exit, the other threatened the driver, and the last one collected the passengers' valuables. A police officer pursued the accused and killed one of the robbers in the process. In this case, the Supreme Court held that the remaining accused were guilty of the special complex crime of robbery with homicide, even if the person killed was one of their co-conspirators, and even if they themselves did not cause the death, but a police officer. The Supreme Court said that the law did not make any distinction as to who was killed and who caused the death, as long as the death resulted by reason or on the occasion of robbery. The crime committed is robbery with homicide. Just a few notes. In robbery with homicide, this offense requires that the main intent of the robber should be to gain, not to kill. Killing is only incidental to the robbery. But what if it is the other way around? What if the main intent is to kill, and after the killing, the offenders took some valuables from the victim? What offense is committed then? In that case, where the intent is primarily to kill, the crime committed is either homicide or murder, depending on the presence of qualifying circumstances, and a separate crime of theft. Last point. Who are liable for the killing? Who are liable for the special complex crime of robbery with homicide? Are all co-conspirators equally liable even if they did not all directly participated in the killing? The general rule is yes. All co-conspirators are liable for the special complex crime of robbery with homicide, even those not directly involved in the killing. The exception is if the conspirator agreed to robbery only, and he did not participate in the killing, and he tried to prevent the killing if he had the opportunity to do so. In such case, the accused will be liable of robbery only, not robbery with homicide. Next is a case in Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act. The gravamen of the offense of human trafficking is the act of recruiting or using another human being for exploitative purposes, such as prostitution or pornography, slavery, sale of organs, among others. And these are committed through coercive, abusive, or deceptive means. Note that this offense can be committed with or without the consent or knowledge of the victim. In the 2023 case of People versus Adrales, the accused approached a 14-year-old girl and arranged for her to have sexual intercourse with another person. The accused was charged with qualified trafficking in persons. Note that if the victim is a minor, the offense is qualified. In defense, the accused argued that the victim was a known prostitute. The Supreme Court dismissed this argument, citing the Sexual Abuse Shield Rule found in the Rule on Examination of Child Witness. Under this rule, evidence showing a victim's sexual predisposition or past sexual behavior is not admissible in any criminal proceeding involving child sexual abuse. The Supreme Court found that all elements of qualified trafficking in persons are present in this case. Trafficking occurs when individuals are recruited, transported, or transferred, regardless of consent or knowledge, under threats, coercion, deception, or abuse of power for exploitative purposes such as prostitution. Additionally, the accused took advantage of the victim's vulnerability. Being a minor, the victim is only 14 years old. Note this Sexual Abuse Shield Rule. This is also relevant in your review for the rule on evidence because this involves the admissibility of evidence, specifically the past conduct of the victim. Next in our review of special penal laws is the Anti-Vouchy Act or the Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children Act. Specifically, the offense of psychological violence under Section 5I of the law. This provision punishes the act of causing mental or emotional anguish to the woman or her child through acts of public ridicule, verbal or emotional abuse, denial of financial support, and similar acts or omissions. Let's note first that although the Anti-Vouchy Act is a special penal law, this offense under Section 5I is mala in se, not malum prohibitum. Hence, it is necessary to prove the accused's specific criminal intent to cause mental or emotional anguish to the victim. In XXX versus People, decided in 2024, the Supreme Court ruled that in the case of marital infidelity, the specific criminal intent to cause mental or emotional anguish is satisfied once the offender commits the act of infidelity. The court said that marital infidelity is inherently wrong under the current social, cultural, and religious norms. Next, in relation to the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act, the Chain of Custody Rule. The Chain of Custody Rule means the duly recorded, authorized movement and custody of seized drugs in each stage of the link, from seizure to receipt by the forensic laboratory to safekeeping to presentation to the court for destruction. The requirement is that before the seized drugs are admitted in evidence, it must be preceded by the presentation of evidence of what the seized object is, as a means of authenticating it. And these pieces of evidence include the testimony of witnesses who handled the seized drugs in the three links in the chain. The three links are, first, from the accused to the seizing officer. Second, from the seizing officer to the forensic laboratory. And third, from the forensic laboratory to its presentation in court. For each link in the chain, everyone who handled the seized items must testify as to how they received the seized item, from whom, where, what they did with the item while in their custody, the condition of the item at the time of receipt and at the time of delivery to the next link in the chain. Next, let's discuss the requirement of marking, inventory, and photographing the seized item. The general rule here is that the marking of seized items must be done immediately, number 1. Number 2, at the place of arrest and seizure. And number 3, it must be made in the presence of 4 witnesses. First is the person from whom the items were seized or his representative. Second is a representative from the DOJ. Third, a representative from the media. And fourth, an elected public official. The complete rules on the chain of custody in drugs cases is in Section 21 of RA 9165. I just covered the marking and inventory since this is the frequent subject of cases and even bar exam questions. Any deviation from the requirements of RA 9165 breaks the chain of custody. If the marking was done even 10 minutes later to wait for the arrival of the witnesses, the chain is broken. If the marking was done at the nearest police station instead of at the place of arrest, the chain is broken. If the marking was done without the presence of all the 4 required witnesses, the chain is broken. Unless there are justifiable grounds for the deviation. So that's number 1 requirement. Number 2, the integrity and evidentiary value of the seized items were preserved. And number 3 requirement, the justifications and steps taken to preserve the integrity and evidentiary value are stated in a sworn statement by the seizing officer. Otherwise, the chain of custody is broken. And what is the effect of a broken chain of custody? The seized item is rendered inadmissible, and the accused will be acquitted for failure to prove the corpus delicti. Let's discuss one final case, the 2023 case of People versus Valencia. The Supreme Court held in this case that discrepancies in the paper trail of the seized drugs break the chain of custody. And this is true even if the discrepancy is only minor. In this case, the police officers conducted a buy-bust operation. The seized drugs were marked at the scene of arrest as FLV-RA-06-16-16. However, in the letter request to the crime laboratory, the item was referred to as FLV-RA-PB-01-16-2016. When the police officers noticed that the markings do not match, the arresting officer altered the marking in the letter request by striking out the figure 20 or 20. So it seems to be just a minor error or a small correction. It seems to be just about the formatting of the date. The marking in the seized item was marked -16, but in the letter request, it was marked -2016. But still, the Supreme Court ruled that this act of altering the letter request already broke the chain of custody. Because when the forensic chemist examined and presented the specimen to the trial court, it was no longer certain that they were the same drugs seized from the accused. So just note this, there can be a variation of this in the bar. The point is, even small deviations can break the chain of custody if that deviation is not justified, and there is no showing that the integrity and the identity of the seized item is preserved despite the deviation, as stated in the testimony of the handling officers. Thank you for listening, future attorneys. I hope this lecture helped you review some of the important criminal law concepts for the last day of the bar. Good luck and see you in the next lecture.